Catherine?
Yeah. Okay, so everyone, if we could just have your attention. Thank you, thank you, thank you, and thank you. And thank you. Hello, over there. Over the back. No, no. We have your attention. Sue, we have your attention, please. We're about to start. Thank you. Okay. And everyone on Zoom, thank you very much. We look like we're having a smoother journey than last month where we had a few technical glitches. Tonight we seem to be on track, so that's great. Just before we start, we've just thrown the transits up for the beginning of the meeting that we might just want to reflect on a little bit there with the Libra rising and the Venus in the 7th, the moon up at the midheaven. Anyone got a feeling on what that's going to tell us about tonight very quickly? All about the women? Jupiter in the 10th, yeah.
Exalted, yeah.
Yes, exalted.
Gemini.
The ruler is in detriment, so we perhaps will have to just put a little bit of work in, but other than that, we should be smooth sailing for tonight. So let's look forward to a very interesting presentation tonight by Josh, who is a good friend of SARs and is well known in the astrological community. Just by way of a little bit of an introduction, Josh has been a practicing astrologer and divination practitioner for the last, 10 or 12 years. He's a graduate of the STA Horary course, and he's the founder of Traditional Astrology Australia, a community dedicated to promoting traditional astrological techniques in the Southern Hemisphere. Do they work in the Northern Hemisphere?
Oh, sounding pretty good so far.
So Josh's talk tonight is on predictive counselling with Horary. So let's give a big warm round of applause to Josh and look forward to it.
Thank you, Bob. Let me just make sure I've got the right screen I'm sharing here. Just give me 1 second. It's not David. Sorry, everyone. 1 second. Okay, let me just make sure we're sharing. All right. If you're there, Kate, can you just let me know if you can actually see those slides?
It's on presentation mode.
Yep, so it's good to go.
Good to go.
All right. So I sort of slightly tweaked the topic because I was working on it before when Mercury was retrograde and then it went direct, and I thought, I've sort of found how I want to present. So a slight tweak to the program. I thought I would talk broadly about the nature of counseling when we're using astrology versus prediction, and where these two things might meet and where they may overlap, where they may diverge. I think that's an interesting subject matter. And before we dive on in, I should probably say that I do like talking quite a lot. So if anything comes up, that if we find ourselves going over some material that perhaps is a little bit confusing, or if anyone has questions, just feel free to jump on in. And much of what I plan to say tonight is something that could be considered kind of contentious in the wider astrological community. And it's not so much that I'm trying necessarily to kick the hornet's nest or anything like that, but rather to generate some interesting discussion, to start talking about what we do, how we do it, what our expectations of it are, and maybe where we can tighten the belt. So as we make our way through, I'm sure that there'll probably be a few people who have very strong opinions about some of the stuff that we're going to talk about. And I encourage that sort of robust rhetoric. I think that that's something that feeds our community through lively discussion. And anyone who's been around in the community for long enough knows that we are kind of a lively bunch. So there is always diverse opinions. So just feel free to have strong opinions. And that's kind of the point of the talk, really. So I'm going to just try and keep an eye on the time. So as we make our way through, before we get rolling, just to give everyone a bit of an idea of how we're going to advance and what we're going to be talking about. First, I want to just take a zip around the evolution of astrological applications. Just talk at a high level about what astrology is, where it began, how it's evolved, not so much from an academic perspective, more from the perspective of a practitioner. We sort of don't have the time to do a big deep dive into the historical narrative of astrology, but there's plenty of people out there doing that sort of work, which you can avail yourselves of. So we'll sort of start by talking about that. We'll make our way through and then talk about doing a little bit of comparing and contrasting. So we'll talk about the scope of natal inquiry and its capacity to counsel. So where we're talking about natal astrology, what is it? What's the extent that we can use it? What are we expecting from it? And talk about some of the pluses and minuses from, or the pros and cons, I suppose, rather, of using natal astrology and what we should expect when we're using that medium of astrology versus using something that is significantly more predictive by way of horary astrology. So we'll dive into that. If anyone's in the room or on the call who's not as familiar with horary as an application of astrology, we'll sort of talk about that at a high level. And of course, we'll have some chart examples as we make our way through as well. So just to give everyone an overview of where we're heading. So again, just a high level idea of where astrology began, right? So arguably, when we think about the structure of a natal horoscope, the first house, as we know for everyone, the ascendant represents the individual, the self. The rest of the chart plugs into all of these different areas in the person's life, everything that's beyond the individual, arguably, you could say. So here we have our little gentleman in the second house here of finances. We see him over here in the seventh house of relationships. And we see him up here in the 10th of career. So one way of looking at astrology back at its earliest inception was to get a bit of an idea of how this person was going to navigate the terrain in this area of their life. Where does the self meet this external terrain? Where we've obviously jumped forward through time and quite substantially jumping over quite a lot of different evolutions in astrology there. But when we jump forward to more of the contemporary side of things, the more present day iteration of astrology, one of the biggest components that I think we would all recognize is the rise of psychology and the notion of the unconscious being something that entered the collective mindset. So we see here two of the big figures in that world, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, who arguably kicked off our understanding of the unconscious mind and that dimension of human experience. Kicking forward a little bit, we get the dawning of the new age, I guess you could say. So the idea of the spiritualist movement where people were identifying with spirituality in a way that was agnostic, I guess you could say, or non-sectarian. This idea that people were embracing spiritual paradigms that went beyond dogmatic religion, that this was the embracing of a new worldview, if you will. And these two things together arguably underpin a lot of what we still use when we are talking about natal astrology. The way that we view it is deeply informed by these worldviews. The next slide here is just some of the leading luminaries in the world of astrology. Off the back of this time, we've got Steve Forrest there, who makes no secret of being a reformed hippie. And like the other lights of that period, just a couple of others. We've got Liz Green, quite well known for her work in the realm of psychological astrology. Demetra George took a similar route, and plenty of others as well. This isn't meant to be an exhaustive list, but just to say that these people formed part of what I would consider to be the pioneering of a new way of looking at astrology, that this was a significant turning point over the course of millennia of astrological application. This was a really significant shift. And when you think about this, if we trace it back to arguably the 1960s, when this all started being pieced together, the way that we're looking at our astrology these days is a lot younger than the way that astrology has been practiced over quite a long span of time, which is not so much to say that to cast any disparagement on it or anything like that at this point, but rather to say that that we're at a turning point. We're at this significant juncture where things are beginning to turn, a pivot, if you will. The reason I say that is because a lot of these pioneers that helped charge forward with this new brand of astrology, if you will, this new application, are getting towards the end of their careers. Like they're getting to the point where they're pulling back, they're not working as much as they were. And well, then I wouldn't say necessarily they're handing on the baton. Many of them still contribute to the community, but there is this pivot in terms of how we're utilizing the knowledge that was pioneered starting back in that time. So a fresh set of voices are coming to the fore, but also as well, our worldview is something that's evolving alongside this pivot. So I just want to sort of just touch on this for a minute. This is a quote that I'll read out in just a moment. But the idea, if we think of the modern approach of astrology as having a lot to do with Steve Forrest uses the phrase psycho-spiritual to describe his approach to astrology. So it's a blend between psychological approaches and spiritualism, and they come together to give you an overview of the individual self. And depending which side of the fence that you're on with that, you may go down the road of looking at it like it's a spiritual paradigm that tells you how to live and what you're here for, or you may go down the road of it telling you how you're genetically made up, I guess you could say. That the planets represent voices in your head, and by understanding them, you can navigate forward productively or more productively because you understand the energies within you. This isn't necessarily a new concept. And here I'll just read this quote from the Tetrabiblos. And it says here, the germination and fruition of the seed must be molded to the quality proper to the heavens at the time. The more observant farmers and herdsmen indeed conjecture from the winds prevailing at the time of impregnation and the sowing of the seed, the quality of what will result. If then a man knows accurately the movements of all the stars, the sun and the moon, why can he not too, with respect to an individual man, perceive the general quality of his temperament from the ambient at the time of his birth? Now, as I say, that comes from the Tetrabiblos. That's a bit of a mouthful. So if we sort of just break it down a little bit, basically what Ptolemy's saying here, it's referred to broadly as the seed theory. The idea being that if we take farming, for instance, that a smart farmer is going to plant a seed at a time that's going to be optimal for harvest. You know, that you're getting an idea of what the end result will be at its inception. And he's basically folding this into an analogy of why could we not also do the same thing for a person effectively? If we can see the end result in the inception, then this is something that we should expect. But this idea of temperament is something that goes back pretty much as far as we have an understanding of astrological history. So it's not so much that it's completely new what we're doing in the modern world. Contemporary practice still embraces this concept, but perhaps just a little more broadly. Something else just to touch on, another major piece of the turning point in astrology, just sort of touching here on this idea of worldviews, of the way that prevailing worldviews have a tendency to shape our expectation of not just life, but to a certain extent ourselves. That whatever the prevailing worldview is, that it has a way of shaping our understanding of what we see as being possible for ourselves. Now, the images here on the left are the pre-industrialization. So let me just read out this quote here. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, humankind's ability to provide basic necessities for themselves and their kin was still a matter of chief concern. Technological advancements and industrialization eased the burden of providing basic necessities. The average family could spend less time in the field, cultivating their own crops, the result of which was that society began to govern itself in new ways, and the prevailing worldview began to evolve as more time, I'm just going to move this bar here, more time could be devoted to intellectual pursuits. So basically, with us having machines doing some of the heavy lifting, in order for us to be able to provide for ourselves and make a living, that in order to in order for us to be able to give ourselves a bit more time for other pursuits, this is something that played a role in shifting that worldview. Sorry, I'm a bit tongue-tied. But just comparing and contrasting here, right? So if we think of people industrialization, people who were farmers by trade, basically people who were tilling their own land in order to be able to provide for themselves and their family. The chief concern that they would be approaching any form of divination, but in this case, obviously, we're talking about celestial divination. They would be consulting the heavens for insight into the nature of that which was going to befall them. There was a greater urge towards understanding what was going on in the world around you. That if you were not in a position to be able to reap a good harvest, then that's something that was hugely detrimental to you. Understanding how you were entering the external world was something that was vital to the way that you lived, as compared with something like today, where we live in arguably a technological age. So we've shifted from these external concerns on account of all of these shifts technologically, and we now have this space to be thinking more about what's going on in the interior world, what's driving us, what are our issues. We can spend more time navel gazing or getting in touch with who we are on the inner level. And when we think about what that means for astrology, if this system's been around symbolically for thousands of years and we're still using it now, what is the implication of that? Just tracking just two major worldviews and this one big shift. We could ask ourselves whether astrology reflects the prevailing worldview. And just to pause briefly, does anyone have a thought about that? Would anyone agree with that sort of concept, that astrology as a divination tool reflects our worldview? You don't think so? Ben, you think so? So we've got strong opinions in the room, one way or the other. Something that I would put on the table for contemplation, because I don't want to act like I'm some authority that is necessarily able to say what is right or wrong, but again, just to give everyone things to chew on. So as the prevailing worldviews change, astrological symbolism remains consistent. So if we look back down the corridor of history, as we've already sort of talked about, we understand that worldviews change. That happens. Like our association with symbols, our expectation of them is something that shifts. Astrological symbolism remains consistent if we practice it consistently. It can be something that lives through the ages. So astrological symbolism remains consistent if we practice consistently. The next piece here, what might feel right for contemporary audiences today may not be so in 100 years from now. And it's not so much to say that expanding the lexicon of astrological knowledge is something that is negative, rather to say that if in 100 years, 500 years, another 1,000 years from now, we can assume that there's going to be a different worldview. And what does our astrology look like at that point if we don't have a benchmark from which to begin our interpretations? So where we're looking at this idea of traditional concepts, traditional frameworks of understanding versus perhaps more modern ways of understanding, I don't think that they necessarily have to be worlds apart, but I think that there's ways that we sort of need to work as a community to bridge that gap, which we'll talk about as we move forward. So just doing a little bit more of the comparing and contrasting here. So just in respect to modern natal astrology, one of the things that we would expect is that it's going to give insight into the subjective reality. Now, depending on how you practice and how you look at it, there's going to be a divergence of opinion around that. The idea being that all of the houses are going to arguably speak to a terrain in life where you would expect that energy to be manifesting. So the idea that something's happening externally that's going to trigger an internal shift. The next one here is, in many cases in modern natal astrology, where there's usually an implicit spiritual lesson that's attached to it. There's one way of looking at the symbolism, particularly if anyone has studied say the evolutionary approach to astrology, the whole paradigm to interpretation is centered around what it is that you came here to learn, what it is that you came here to learn and grow within yourself as an individual, to pick up on some issues that you maybe didn't get to resolve from a prior lifetime. That's one of the expectations of the modern approach. There's also the overarching intended direction of soul, which is closely linked to what I said just a moment ago. But what I mean by this point, it's an important point here, is that even in these approaches that at face value claim to be all about free will, all about your own choice for your own direction, your ability to be able to shape your life based on how you feel and how you think, that if you understand yourself, like I said before, then these energies are things that you can harness and you can direct in order to be able to manifest a life that's in line with your energy. But implicit in that, in like this, the flip side of that same coin, is that there is a life that you should be leading. And by understanding the symbolism, you're getting a rough idea of what that playing field is meant to look like. So even though a lot of modern approaches don't necessarily claim to tell you what to do, there's still a certain set of parameters in which an interpretation is going to play out. And based on the interpretation of the chart, we would expect to arrive at that place. Some things that are worth thinking about as a community. So some ways I was saying a minute ago that we could perhaps tighten the belt as a community. If we take, for example, this is a chart, a natal chart on the inside. We don't need to spend too much time here, but just to put forward an idea of what I'm talking about. If we were to use natal astrological principles, we see what's circled here at the top of the chart. We see Saturn making its application to a conjunction with the midheaven. So if we're using natal astrological principles, talking about the planet Saturn, one of the things that most people are going to expect from an interpretation from a modern astrologer would be that Saturn is telling you where you have outgrown something. You have outgrown this area of your life. That implicit in natural Saturnian energy is the idea that it's connected with the long term, the idea that at this point in time, it's time to sow seeds into the future. So implicit in a lot of what we would expect from a modern astrologer is this idea that Saturn's encouraging you to get the ball rolling on the next cycle. So some sense of change is implicit in the way that we would interpret this symbol. Going back to some other things I said before, if we're embracing this blindly in the natal approach, we're also accepting that it's no coincidence that you happen to have Saturn here at this time, that this is a period, the heavens have said that this is a period where it is your time to learn through hardship, to grow, to change, to sow those seeds for the future. Now, depending on our recipient, depending on our end user, shall we say, let's use the word client that comes to you. And using this kind of approach, a client, if we assume that they're an astrological layman, they've come on in, and usually, as we know, with astrological symbolism, that's going to probably hit the spot. You'd say there's probably some trouble at work at the moment. And they'd say, yes, my God, you're brilliant. And you would say, yes, well, it's time to grow. It's time to change. It's time that you sow these seeds for the future. The person on the other end of that is going to walk out having a moment where they feel truly seen. It's given context to their experience. It's given meaning to what's going on because the heavens said it. But in the realm of natal astrology, we're dealing with the diagnosis at this point. This is kind of like the weather report of sorts, right? Now, not forgetting for a moment that a lot of the paradigms in modern natal astrology are connected with everything I've just been talking about. This idea of spiritual development, spiritual growth. This is what you're here to do. I'm just going to move this out of the way so I can read my slide. Similar to forming a diagnosis and treatment. Sorry, let me say that again. This is kind of similar. If we go back to our Saturnian element and we look at what was just on the screen a moment ago, this is kind of similar to forming a diagnosis and a treatment plan based off one single symptom without considering all of the essential factors. And obviously, I've got some medical symbols here. The rather obvious analogy being that if somebody's ill, you wouldn't just see, oh, you've got a runny nose, well, we need to take the leg off, just to be facetious. The idea being that the diagnosis is something that's formed based off a single piece. Obviously, as astrologers, we would aim to be taking in as much as possible. But I think we could all agree that that's a fairly standard approach to interpreting Saturn on the midheaven. I just want to contrast this with something like horary astrology. So as we begin to sort of pivot to more towards talking about horary as an application and its capacities, it's worth pointing out that horary is often looked at as well, in the past, I think many of us these days, as horary is experiencing its renaissance, are trying to pioneer a different view around this application of astrology. That in the past, it was derided for a long time as being something that was fatalistic, that was rigid in its approach, that when you practiced horary, that you were, I actually heard a talk recently by a very well-known astrologer who referred to horary as fate casting, that if you asked a question of horary, then by casting the chart and looking at the answer, you were in so doing sealing your fate. You know, this idea that what you see in horary symbolism is rigid and can't be worked with. So we know that that's in the background where it comes to more recent associations with horary. Some of the things that make horary different from natal astrology, for anyone who's not familiar with it in the room or on the call, is that horary looks the same. You're still dealing with a horoscope. So it's still the same chart, it's the same symbolism. But when you cast a horary chart, we're looking at that chart with a predetermined context. So we're not taking in the broad sweep of life and trying to figure out why our boss is being so horrible or what's going to happen in my relationship. This chart is uniquely speaking to the context of the question that we're approaching it for. There is, by virtue, a narrower scope of inquiry, which is implicit in what I just said. And it gives insight into the forthcoming unfoldment, which, just to sort of extrapolate on that a little bit, the idea that depending on the perspective, you could see horary as something that's rigidly telling you what's going to happen, or rather that it's just giving you insight into that which is going to unfold. And what you do with that information is then something that is up to you. That's kind of the point of it, right? That you're able to use it as a gauge to understand the way that things are unfolding. We'll sort of talk about that a little bit more as we move forward. I'm just going to move this out of the way a little bit. It allows us to see beyond ourselves, and I'll demonstrate that as we look at some of the chart examples tonight and get into just showing you how it works as compared with natal astrology. So the aim here being that at this point, just to sort of highlight some of the things I'm talking about, it's not so much that I think natal astrology in a modern context should be thrown out in the way that we use it. I personally believe that when we talk about natal planets in a psychological way, I find that deeply profound, and it speaks to somebody's lived experience in a way that almost no other system, no other symbol system can. It's something that is so tied to the reflective process of what a person's going through. However, as I grow in my astrology and my knowledge of life and the world and divination in general, see natal astrology as having some limits, and I have a lot of trouble predicting using natal forecasting. And by predicting, I mean in the realm of what's going to happen. So if we go back to our Saturn example from just a moment ago, Saturn's on the midheaven, you know, it's time for you to change. You're having trouble at work, right? And the client says, yes, my God, yes. You're probably sick of it. We all know the feeling of Saturn. It's not fun. It's not a good time. Yes, I am sick of it. If we were only using natal astrology, then we would be giving someone advice to quit their job and change their life. Someone in my life, a brother of mine, uses that as almost like cookie cutter wisdom. It's terrible to go to for advice. That's always what you wind up at. Quit your job, change your life. But in this context, Saturn on the MC, quit your job, change your life. The universe says that it's the time. And someone walks out and they're like, my God, they're right. I am sick of it. Now, the one thing that I think we all have to be vigilant of is that using just that framework alone, we have no idea what lies on the other side of that for that person. Telling someone that if we're treating just the symptom here and we're seeing Saturn bringing some difficulty into work, to then walk on the other side and say, well, implicit in this is that you need to grow by learning how to do this hard thing of stepping away from the career that you've built for yourself. Now, just stepping away from all astrology and just thinking humanly for a moment, the world that we live in is not very conducive to chopping and changing. We tend to have a very finite sort of world that we live in. The world sort of trains us to pick something and stick to it. Can we change? We can, but we're celebrated and life is easier when we just stick to a path. So invariably, let's imagine for a moment someone chooses to go down the road of becoming a doctor, and they make all the money that a doctor does. It's a celebrated career and it has been for thousands of years. And they get the house in the eastern suburbs and the cars, and they've got the kids in the primary school. And if they walked into an astrologer and they've got Saturn on the midheaven, it's time. It's time for you to change your life. The implication of what we're saying to someone in that situation is more vast than what we could see through the symbolism of natal astrology by itself. It's a tool that's certainly directing us in the right way, but without something that's able to take in the wider landscape, then we're sort of shooting in the dark about how we could give advice to that, at least by way of looking at the entirety of the being or the unit, without taking in the whole life. So this is a quote that comes from Dane Rudhyar. And let me read this up. For anyone who's unfamiliar with Dane Rudhyar is basically the grandfather of modern astrology. That a lot of his books were deeply influential. Everyone sees him as a humanistic astrologer who champions this idea of the consciousness and identifying with symbolism in a way that helps you move forward with clarity by understanding yourself. And as we said a moment ago, of course it does. So you'd think someone like Dane Rudhyar is completely against horary. And here's the quote. He says, "A horary chart does not say, do this. It presents a symbolic image of all the essential factors in any critical situation. It does not make life easier, but man more conscious of the total implications of the difficult turning points at which he has to make choices." Now, this quote is something that I found and was deeply excited by because it fits my talk perfectly. But also, it's such a profound statement from somebody who is already deeply enmeshed in the modern approach to astrology. He was arguably the first pioneer of this kind of astrology. And what he's saying here unequivocally, a horary chart does not say to do this. It is not rigidly fatalistic, but makes life easier and man more conscious to let me read that again, of the difficult turning points at which he has to make choices. There's a section in here where he says it brings to light all of the essential factors, this idea that it allows us to see just beyond our own experience into what else is perhaps going on in the situation. So just pivoting again here a little bit and just talking a little more about the nature of horary astrology. It's a complex area of practice. It's something that takes a fair bit of time to learn, but explaining it at a high level is fairly simple. So let me just quickly turn on a couple of these annotations here. That what you're doing in a horary chart, if we accept the first house as having to do with the individual who's asked the question, they're always going to be symbolized by the sign that's on this cusp and the planet that rules it. No matter what the question is, in this case, we see an example question, will I win the court case? So we would refer to this person as the querent, the person who's asked the question, and then we want to locate in the chart the subject matter that we're asking after. So in this case, if the question was about a court case, then we may be looking to the 9th house for legal matters, or we may be looking at the 10th house for judges, depending on the nature of the inquiry, what you needed to know. You might use both of those things, right? This isn't a real chart. This is just something that is just to demonstrate this idea that what you would do is ultimately you would then locate the significant pieces of the pie here. So we see Venus up here ruling our person that asked the question. If we accept that Aries over here at the 7th house is the opposing party, the person who is the open enemy, if you will, then we see Aries on the cusp. So we would then locate our other significator being Mars and try and understand what kind of relationship they're in together by virtue of the chart. We'd be looking for aspects. We'd be looking for things applying by aspect, separating by aspect to give us an overview of what's going on. In horary, you're looking for an aspect. If an aspect forms, then that's a good thing. It means that something that you're inquiring after is within your capability of obtaining. In this case, if we were to simply turn our attention to, say, the judge in the matter here, just a very high-level example, what we see is up here, we've got Cancer up there on the MC. And just very simply, we see the ruler of Cancer being the novice. The ruler of Cancer being the moon, which is down there making an application to the ascendant. So the fact that the ruling planet of the judge is leaning towards our querent, it's looking pretty good, you know, at a high level. There's a lot more that you would take into account, but just simply put, you're locating the subject matter in the question and seeing how it relates to the person who's asked about it. Is it positive? Is it negative? Is there anything happening at all? And let me get into a couple of examples here. Let me close this off.
Is it the higher courts the ninth house and the lower courts the seventh?
It depends on the context of the question. Sometimes you wouldn't need to split them out like that. If it's already in a particular courtroom, then you could just stick with the natural signification, is my feeling anyway. Let me just turn that off.
I feel they should have asked the question completely.
Yeah, well, that's a big part of horary practice.
Favourable outcome. Because they could have settled outside of court with a favourable outcome.
That's right.
And then they could get no, but it could still be a favourable outcome.
This quote here comes from William Lilly, who is in horary circles. Everyone knows about William Lilly. We've all read his books. His works are fantastic, and we have an example in here from him tonight. And something that Lilly didn't actually come up with this quote, but it's on a lot of things to do with him, for lack of a better phrase. And that phrase is, the stars incline, they do not compel. The idea being that what you see in a horary chart isn't something that's going to twist your arm or lead you towards a fate that you can't change. Things are inclining this way, but they don't compel. You can make a shift if you wanted to. You can use the insight that comes out of a horary chart to shift direction or change pace in order to be able to attempt to try and achieve an optimal outcome. Arguably, that's the point of all divination. You know, if you get insight into what's going to unfold, if it's optimal, you can just kick back and just let things go because everything looks great. If it looks challenging, which is what we see more often than not, then the benefit is that you can use that insight to either subvert the challenge, work with it, or attempt to do something to change the outcome. That's something that we would be aiming for with this approach. So this example we're about to dive into, it's one of my favorite, and I've used it before. So for anyone who's seen it, you're getting another whip around the garden. But this example comes from William Lilly's England's Prophetical Merlin. So he was quite prolific in his day in terms of his written output. And England's Prophetical Merlin was written at a time of great upheaval in the United Kingdom. But for our purposes, we're going to zip to the end of this particular pamphlet and have a look at an example chart that he published as part of this. So as you can see here, it comes from 1644 all the way through to us here today. So over on the left, we've got just a caption from Lilly. So the question itself is, a gentlewoman desired to know if she should have an aged man, yes or no. So we'll sort of do a little bit of interpreting around Lilly's Middle English here. Basically, a young woman comes to him and says, should I marry this guy? Not uncommon today. Is this going to be something that works out? What we see here, I'm just going to try and tidy these up so people can actually see the chart. Just bear with me a second. Let me move that over there. 1 second. I don't think we need anything down there. Apologies for that. So here's the chart here on the right-hand side. So once again, we would be approaching this to inquire about what sort of dynamic this woman's going to have with the potential partner. So first of all, we would locate the person who's asked the question. Once again, we see Virgo on the ascendant, ruled by the planet Mercury. So Mercury is going to tell us something about the person who's asked the question. For anyone who is more familiar with symbolism, Mercury has a natural signification of youth or younger people. So we know that a young woman came and asked the question. So already at this point, we see that there's some link with the chart and the person who is coming to the room, that we would expect it to describe her. The party inquired after, rather, we see the seventh house, which has rulership of all romantic matters. In the modern day and age, this kind of gets divvied up a lot. Some people will talk about the eighth as being a deep relationship or the physical intimacy. The fifth house might be early burgeoning romance, this kind of thing. But in the seventh house, we find in Horary that it pretty much suits most purposes that are related to romance. And over here, we see Jupiter ruling the aged man. It's worth pointing out here that Jupiter actually signifies people who are in the prime of life. So I suppose when you were living in Lily's age, if you were in the prime of life, you were considered old, that this person is like getting on in years. But so we could imagine somebody who's probably like late 20s, early 30s, perhaps, you know. But we see this person signified by Jupiter. So our next step as we go to unpack this horary is that we'll read out from Lily here. So we're looking for some relationship between the two things that signify these parties. Lily says, considering that Mercury had lately separated from a sextile of Jupiter and the moon by a quadrate, which is a square, I judged there had lately been some treaty, that's a typo, some treaty about it, which was confessed. So basically what he's saying, in Horary, if planets are separating, if they're moving away from each other, that's kind of like letting us rewind the tape and see what's already happened. That when they were in aspect to each other, something occurred. So we can use it to sort of, within reason, see what's unfolded within the context of the question. So he's saying here that because they were in an aspect, that there was some form of agreement that was already in place between these two people. And she confessed that. He goes on to say, the old man did much importune it because Jupiter receives Mercury in his exaltation and casteth a friendly trine to the degree ascending. So that's a bit wordy, but anyone who practices from a traditional perspective would be using things like the table of essential dignities to ascertain the nature of the connection here. So because Jupiter receives Mercury, then this was something that underscored the fact that this man, this aged man, was pretty keen on the idea. You know, this young girl says, how about it? And he says, absolutely. But here we see her moving away from him. So he can see based on the aspects in the chart that there was some sort of agreement that was in place. And there's the trine. We see Jupiter's kind of separating from this trine here, but just underscoring that point. Further on, this one's a little bit more wordy, so we'll just unpack it together. Seeing the moon carried the light from Jupiter to Mars, and Mercury was going to a quartile, which is a square, of Mars, I judged that the maid's affection was alienated from the old man, and that she desired such a man as Mars, a captain or a soldier. So basically using the moon to give us a further piece of information about the person who asked the question. So effectively, in simple language here, it was in aspect to Jupiter, which was, as we know, the aged man, but it's now moving to form an aspect to Mars. And because of that, Lily's saying, well, you know, you're actually moving away from this person and you're applying to someone like this, someone who is martial in their nature, a captain or a soldier. So if we just pause for a minute, this young girl's walked in and said, am I going to marry this old man? And he says, well, what are you talking about? Like, I mean, the chart says that you're actually interested in someone who's probably a bit younger and someone who's a military type person. So times haven't changed. Like the young woman was probably drawn to these burly types in the army. And where are we here? We see that square that's forming between Mercury and Mars. Lily doesn't go into this, but I think there was probably some issues with the soldier as well. So this young girl's not having much luck. So just when we look at it from this perspective, when everyone's probably heard the idea that the eighth house in traditional astrology is associated with other people's money, the reason being that if we pretend that our seventh house cusp is the first house of the person who is being asked after, then the seventh becomes the first. It's either referred to as a derived house, or we sometimes just colloquially refer to it as turning the chart. So the seventh house becomes the first house of the person asked after, and the eighth house becomes their second house, and so on and so forth. This becomes important as we move forward in the example here, where Lily says, I bade the maid require a jointure of the old man, but then it appeared he could not make any, there being an encumbrance upon his land, as Saturn with Mars in his second house of substance doth excellently signify. So a jointure is basically when somebody would settle their estate on their partner. So if this person was to pass away, then everything would effectively go to their spouse. So because of the signatures up here in the 8th house, which we'll touch on in a minute, this is the person who is asked after, the aged man. This 8th house symbolism is actually his second house of finances. So we see up here the planets Mars and Saturn. In traditional language, these are considered to be malefic, to be having some influence in that area of his life that is not necessarily positive or generative. And oh, where are we here? So let me just say that last part again. So in other words, he said to the young girl, go off and have a look into his finances, pretty much. See what's going on. No doubt, being a man of the world, Lily probably understood that there was a reason why the young girl was interested in shacking up with this old man. The chart's already saying you've got some conflicted feelings. So what is it that you might want to be marrying this man for? Look what's happening in the house of money. So he sent her off to do further investigation of her own. And as he says here, there was an encumbrance upon his land, as Saturn with Mars in his second house of substance doth excellently signify. So in other words, the land wasn't his. The land was spoken for. And this was reflective in the symbolism at the time that this girl presented and asked the question. So this is something that I find uniquely fascinating about horary astrology. And I'm a fan of all divination. That's probably no secret. But something that I find uniquely fascinating and endlessly interesting to me about horary is that we can't move the planets. So with all other types of divination, whether we used runic tablets or tarot or Lenormand or yarrow sticks, all of these things, it's in our dominion to be able to use them when we see fit. The thing about horary, it's one of those chicken egg questions, right? Where it's like when you see this strong testimony come up at the time the person asked the question, what sort of force was at play to get the person to ask the question at that moment? And sometimes when someone comes to you with a question, it's often unexpected. I find that when people come to me for a horary, this happened. I've had to make peace with it. I've got Capricorn rising. I like structure, but even though often I'm not that structured, but I like to know the shape of my day. And if I have someone booked in, almost without fail, every time it's a horary, it's late. The person's late. They're stuck at work, or they get caught up for an hour, which is significant in terms of rising times. And people are always emailing, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry, I'm stuck in traffic." And I've learned just to not only give myself more time because I'm probably going to need it, but it's no coincidence that the person's coming later, because the chart is already going to line itself up to reflect the nature of their question. So something else is going on when we do this stuff, and I find it utterly fascinating. Yes.
Yeah, the fact that the planets have to be in a certain position, doesn't it make any predictive techniques more fatalistic and reducing the ability to actually have free will?
Yeah. So just for everyone on the call that probably couldn't hear that, the fact that the planets align themselves in a spot at a particular time, like we were just talking about, doesn't that mean that it is by virtue of that it is more fatalistic? Well, we'll talk about that in just a moment. So when we click forward, Lily's the final piece here. As you can probably imagine, it's not something that's hard to imagine. This guy's got no money. And then Lily writes here at the end, after this, they broke off all terms of marriage. Like, she wasn't interested after that. She thought, no, I'm gonna go back and keep looking effectively. So the key piece of why I like this chart so much and why I return to it so often, let's just unpack it a little bit in terms of what we've just talked about. So for anyone unfamiliar, it probably sounds like a lot. So we'll just kind of sum it up a little bit here, right? One of the key takeaways with this is that Lily did not judge yes or no in respect to this young woman's question. So she's come in and she said, look, are we likely going to marry? He could have turned around based on the symbolism and said, no, you're not. And been able to issue that prediction fairly confidently based on what was there in the chart. But he didn't do that. He didn't limit her creative potential based on the way that he approached the symbolism. In fact, he did it kind of the reverse of that. He gave her insight which was free from both religious or spiritual overtures. This is coming from somebody who wrote a book titled Christian Astrology. Lilly was a deeply, devoutly religious man, and in almost all of his astrological writings, he's thanking a superior being. He's thanking God. So this is a man who believed in a higher power. He didn't believe in astrology as a religion, but he saw it as effectively, you could say, God's working. But he didn't bring this into the chart in any way. Obviously, we only get his summation, but he's using the symbolism to be able to give this woman insight without putting too many layers on the top, right? Returning to what I was saying before, this idea that, that this has happened because you need to learn and grow from this. He's just said, look, here's what's here, Ultimately, he encouraged her. This is the part that I really like. He encouraged further inquiry based on the symbolism. So he didn't say, I am the astrologer extraordinaire. I'm obviously worth the price that you're paying me. You can trust what I tell you. He actually said, you know what, go off and do some research for yourself. Here are these signatures, and I suggest that you look into it. So he encouraged her to go off and learn something empirically, to learn about this in the manifest world, which ultimately empowered the querent, being the young woman, with the knowledge to make her own decision with confidence. So rather than tell her, you have to do this, or the symbols say this, or this looks awful, he didn't take too much ownership for her direction in this situation, rather used the message of the chart to be able to help her arrive at a place of making a decision more confidently within herself. She could have probably still gone out and made this work with this old man. As he said at the beginning, he was quite attracted to the proposition, but her feelings were changing and there was very little that was going to be in it for her. So I want to pause there for a minute before we go to another example. How's that tracking for everyone? Do we have any questions, any thoughts about anything so far? Did anyone have any sort of association with Horary as being rigidly fatalistic?
Three chats there. I don't know if that's
Let me just have a quick look here. Everyone's in wild agreement. But no questions. How's everyone doing?
So basically, the Horary is kind of it's a snapshot telling the quality or the nature of time. Right?
Mm.
So will you be looking also at the Hour Lord?
Yeah, you can do that. Yeah, in when you're using the question for everyone on the call there was that do you use the hour lord? So for anyone who's not familiar with this, the days of the week actually have their name origin in planetary signification. We get Monday, the day of the moon, Sunday, the day of the sun.
It's actually called Hora, and the Horary has come from that.
Exactly. Yeah. Hora comes from is it time?
Yes.
Yeah. Time or hour. Yeah. Yeah, that the iteration of the word horary also has a meaning to do with time. Yeah. And the idea being that if you're doing more sophisticated horary, one of the things that you would learn as you make your way through is to have a look at these finer details, like the planetary day, the planetary hour, which has to do more with the Chaldean order. You really do get into the weeds with it when you get rolling, but it's something that absolutely, yeah, you would look at that stuff moving forward. One of the things with horary practice, which I haven't mentioned, is it's easy to kind of keep casting charts if you get a bad answer. The idea that should I marry this old guy? Oh, it doesn't look great. Let's ask again in an hour. The idea that you can't trifle with it like that. So as astrologers, our job would be figuring out, does this chart accurately reflect the nature of the question? We would refer to it as, is it radical? Which is to say, is it rooted? Is it actually linked with what's going on here in the manifest world? And there are techniques to sort of try and figure that out. But something like the planetary hour and day is a technique that you would use to do that, to try and figure out whether or not it is radical. Just one of a few techniques.
Does that give us insight whether it's a
Yeah.
stupid question?
Yeah. There's also one of the things I love about horary and astrology all the time. As soon as you start doing this, you kind of can't stop doing it, is like physical associations with people. And I find myself walking around the shops and I see a pasty person and I'm like, oh, the moon. The moon's probably an aspect in this person's natal chart, that you see these physical characteristics shine through based on the planetary symbolism, which is truly wild when you think about it. Because when we think about, a lot of people want to get into other discussions about the influence of the planets. They're making their effect felt visibly. But then when we look at our zodiac, we're using signs, not constellations. So the idea of there being a 100% link with planetary energy on us to a physical sense begins to fall apart when we start using the constellations like that, at least in some cases. But then you see this representation in the world around you all the time. So we've got some people in the room who practice Indian or Vedic astrology, people who use different zodiacs and things like that. And I'm not saying that they don't work, but the Western tropical zodiac blows me away. And how it works is something that we can only ever guess about. But it's one of the things that you'd look for. Like the idea that you would expect to see a signification of the person in the chart. Yeah.
Something a little bit out there.
Yeah.
To think that she's marrying him and found out she's not going to marry him because he doesn't have money.
Yeah.
She shouldn't be marrying him.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the underlying thing. I've found in life, you can say to people, and they've all got their broken up story, why did you marry him?
Yeah.
My friend once said for a wardrobe, it was 100 years ago, and I thought she wanted somebody to build a wardrobe. No, she wanted all the clothes in fox furs. All those go away. That's not a basis of living.
No, yeah.
Those life. Time was very different.
Yeah, 17th century, you've got some money. Yeah.
Well, it couldn't work.
No.
So we had a question in the chat that does this tie in with tarot. I would probably at a surface level say no. The only reason that I find you'll see I find all divination systems will try and speak to life in their own way, and some are uniquely capable of looking at things from a particular perspective in a way that gives you deep insight, where others simply struggle. And with something like, I mean, you could attempt to do it, but I've never actually done it. Has anyone else in the room? What about?
Example, and you're using tarot, I mean, this is awkward because you're using it under astrological wheel,
Yeah.
and somebody asked you a horary type question, you could look at it if the tarot cards were placed in the 12.
Yeah.
But then you have to
Yeah.
do astrologer, which is contrary to theatre.
Yeah, I mean, there's an idea, like, I mean, a lot of people use different systems, and it really depends on the nature of what the person's coming and asking you for. Like tarot is really great at energy, right? But then sometimes you're like, what's going to happen at work? And you pull the Queen of Cups and you're like, God damn it, what does that mean? Like, it's difficult to be able to see the way that it's going to manifest when it's speaking about energy.
In a private reading, you have the option of astrology.
Yeah.
If you're on a psychic fair, you're doing a 15-minute reading, and you're not having your astrology in front of you, and you may have to think off the top of your head at what the astrology is. You're basically using your tarot in the 12-card circle, so you're applying.
Yeah, you could do that.
To the tarot rather than the tarot to the astrology.
I find where it comes to
tarot. Because in a 15-minute reading, if you ever done any at the psychic fairs, you know how people fluff around until they get to the last 2 minutes to ask the question, you know.
Yeah.
Or if you tell them at the beginning.
There's something about horary practice too that it's because it is something that's reasonably finite, you know, it's a one-time question, that there are certain questions it's not fantastic with. Like, you know, if somebody's going to say, should I do this or that? It doesn't really love those kinds of questions. Some people attempt to do them. I find them too challenging. It doesn't really also allow for checking in around a situation too often. So you'll get a client come and then you give them this great horary reading, and then, you know, a week or two later, they're like, oh, I want to ask about that relationship. And horary doesn't play ball like that. It wants you to hear what it's got to say, and it's profound in its symbolism. It's so direct in terms of its timing. It's in many ways, it's one of the most accurate systems that I've ever used. But it has its restrictions like everything, right? And I guess to sort of hark back to where we were talking about this idea of modern natal astrology, not so much to be disparaging about it, but where are its limits? Where do we find that we have to draw a boundary in our expectation with it? If modern astrology has reached a point where we've basically been practicing it for nearly a single generation, what can we learn about everything that we've done during that time? How can we perfect it? How can we make it better? Do we need to look at some of our expectations and say, you know what, that kind of didn't work? In the same way that we do with traditional astrology, that there are certain signatures, if you read the ancient texts, that will mean that you're a whore, you know, or you're a slave. These things that probably had meaning at one point in time, but they don't bear relevance in terms of our modern world. So that is a process that I think that we should all continually be engaged in. And we don't kind of talk about that stuff enough, but I'm pretty sure we've all had a day where something's gone down and we're like, oh God, what is going on? Like, you know, I did get my chart out and have a look. And then you look at your chart and you're coming up empty. And you're like, no, maybe it's that, maybe it's this. And it's not so much that it fails, but I think it may not be the right astrological tool for the right application, that we can use astrology in these different ways. And I think natal astrology has a place for sure. But what about these other techniques? Do we need to take the stigma out of them, basically?
Just on your question about rigidity,
Mm.
the rigid nature, I personally think that's part of the strength of this particular technique.
Yeah.
Because without Saturn and Mars being bad,
Mm.
malefics, you wouldn't get the fact that the partner doesn't have any money, and that's
Yeah.
the reason that she's asking.
Yeah.
So I think the rigid nature of the rules around horary are important and powerful.
Yeah.
But then the application of it, which is I think the example we've used with Lily, is to say, okay, here's the information.
Yeah.
You still have a choice in terms of how you'd like to respond to that
Yeah.
now that you have this information.
Yeah.
But without the rigid nature of, you know, the central dignities and whatever else, like that's the weakness of modern astrology, is that,
Yeah.
oh, well, if you tried really hard, you can work with that.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Or if you, as opposed to saying, this is actually not good for you.
Yeah.
And depending on the nature of the question and the technique you're using, I think that rigid, prescriptive nature of horary
Can be a strength. Yeah.
really important.
For anyone,
Yes or no question.
yeah, you go.
When you want a specific
Yeah.
answer.
But following on to that is a lot of people call it prescription or judgment, but it's actually considerations before judgment,
Yeah.
right? And radical basically means the chart can be read. So you can have all these things saying that this isn't the chart to read, but if the moon describes Aquarian and the signifier describes Aquarian, then the chart can be read.
Yeah.
And I've had this argument with other astrologers.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We're getting comments just for everyone on the call about something that's called considerations before judgment. And depending on what kind of room you're in, some people will call it strictures against judgment, that if something's like this, then you can't read the chart. Common one, if you get a rising sign that's either early degrees from 0 to 3 or late degrees from 27 to 29, that the chart can't be read. And usually that's usually not the case. Like, I mean, I've read a lot of charts that have early and late degrees rising, but they form an a piece of the interpretive puzzle. It's telling you something about the nature of the question. It's either too far gone or it hasn't gotten started yet, you know, those sorts of things. So that's definitely, I totally agree with that. Ben's point was that that's where it comes to using some of the more traditional language in astrology, where I was sort of saying in one of the earlier slides that worldviews change. Prevailing worldviews are things that change over time, and the things that we need astrology to be eternal. Like, astrology's been around for thousands of years, and I think what we've done during this last generational cycle in astrology is we've breathed more life into the symbolism, and we understand at a deeper level the way that planetary energy feels. You know, we can talk about it in a way that actually corresponds to the psyche, to the psychological feeling. We know what it's bringing up. And there is a way in which, like, we do see this link with the external world with modern astrology. Of course we do. But in my personal practice, I find that I'm very careful about issuing advice based off of a natal interpretation alone, because I have no idea how that's going to go. Now that I've got horary as part of my skill set, I could never not use it. You know, if somebody comes to me and says, "Oh, should I stay with this person?" Or in our next chart example, you know, should I move into this business partnership? It would be too hard for me to just simply look at Saturn on the MC and say, "Oh, well, you know, of course," you know, because I don't know. Yeah.
Do you think Horary is better at answering questions, will I, rather than should I?
Depends on the context. So the question for anyone, in case they didn't hear it, is Horary good at answering questions better as will I or should I? In a general sense, should questions are deeply problematic, because usually you're getting somebody wanting to come and they're wanting a signature from the gods that they should do something, or usually should I not do something, but in that sort of situation, it's almost like, this is my personal belief around what we can see through any symbol system is that when someone has taken action, if they've sort of pushed a domino over and there's a natural flow-on effect that we know is on the way, that flow-on effect is something that you can see fairly easily if you know how to read symbolism. You can find that. If a person's sitting back and they've done absolutely nothing and they're sitting here going, oh God, I just don't know what to do. Should I go here? Should I go there? We might get an idea at a very, very high level, just looking at like their progressions or their progressed moon, their transits. Like we may get some idea of the parameters in which they're probably working with. But as soon as they've taken action, that's when everything gets a little clearer, and suddenly you've got juice in what you're looking at. And depends on the context though, because if you get to get someone come to you with a situation that was very real, where a common one is, should I apply for this job? Now, if they are seriously looking at applying for it, the thing with Horary that you learn about when you learn the craft is that you have to want it. Like I always think of people in the ancient world lining up for God knows how long outside the Oracle of Delphi's cave. She's inside sniffing fumes, and you're outside, you're outside baking in the sun. Like, come on, like, let's get on with it. But these people lined up to ask their one question, and they went in and they got their answer, and off they went, right? And that's kind of like Horary. If you aren't serious about it, the chart won't answer. There'll be signatures in there that as astrologers we're trained to look for. Just be careful of this, be wary of that. So if they mean it, if it's pressing to them, should I apply for this job? There's a way in which even a speculative chart will show you a reflection of that pathway, even though they haven't walked down it yet. But if they don't want it and it's more trifling, which as astrologers, we can't always tell. We don't know how serious they are, but you're on shaky ground when it's connected to something that they're not deeply invested in. So it is challenging. But in the general sense, like if you have a pressing question, Horary, I find, is just the most robust in terms of its ability to be able to speak to the pathway that's going to unfold. We've got a question here in the chat again. What about the outer planets? They were only found recently. This is something that is often misunderstood. So a lot of people assume that because traditional astrologers practice with traditional interpretive techniques, that the outer planets just get thrown out the window. In something like Horary practice, many people, myself included, will practice with recognizing the influence of those planets, but not using them as rulers. And what I mean by that is a common one. Let's imagine that we've got Aquarius that's on the ascendant or the descendant, and we're looking for the planet that rules that person. I would be looking to Saturn rather than Uranus. So if Uranus is tightly configured in a chart, if it's like very closely conjunct a planet or conjunct an angle, it's going to make itself felt. It will be present in the chart. I've got chart examples where Uranus has played out with, I think it was right at the end of a degree, and it was within a matter of days that it ticked over to the next degree, which is not common with Uranus. That normally takes a long time. And it was directly pivotal to the question. So I still use them, but a lot of people think we just leave them out. But
it's interesting because in your chart, when she married,
Yeah.
the derived fourth house of the man she was interested in, Pluto was approaching his fourth house.
Yeah.
Which Pluto didn't exist, couldn't really drew up the chart.
Yeah.
It existed. Well, not for him.
It's a fascinating area of thought. This is another one. I'm mindful of time, but I've got another example here I thought we could dive into. This comes from an actual does everyone see that bar? Do I maybe just need to change the way I've shared that? Just bear with me 1 second. Is that better? No. Okay, I've tried.
You go back to that setting in the top right one, you have options.
Is that we'll go with that. So here is should we partner? So this is an actual chart that I received from somebody who owns their own business. They've had this business for quite some time. They've built it up from nothing. It's now quite successful. But at this point in time, this person came to me asking, I'm basically looking at partnering. Do you think I should do it? And I was like, okay, let's see what we've got. Now, I think it doesn't really matter how long you've given readings for, or how confident you are in the symbolism. There's always a little bit of a flurry of like, my God, like when you're on the spot, it's like, I need to be having a look at this and I need to come up with an answer. I find my approach is just simply unpacking it one piece at a time. Always just kind of leads you to the answer. So just going back to what we know, let me just turn on some annotations here, just so we can have a quick zip around. So we do see what could be considered a consideration before judgment, 27 degrees on the ascendant. So this person's been thinking about this for a long time, right? I mean, this isn't something that has just come up. We see our querent, the person who's asked the question, over here in detriment in the 6th house. So we would expect that this person's probably working really hard at the moment. I like to try and get as much information as I can in any question that comes to the table, even if it seems irrelevant. I just like to get an idea of what's going on, right? So we see her over there in detriment. Things aren't great, right? If we just sort of clear this up a little bit, her 2nd house ruler being Jupiter over there in the sign of Gemini, where it is in detriment. So the first thing that I was alerted to was the fact that this person's got some money problems, that this is probably what's fueling the question of should we partner. It's probably what's pushing her out there. But of course, when you're dealing with a client, I'm kind of fond of this saying, and I'll say it again because I always do. All clients lie. All clients lie. And everyone goes, oh my God, I can't believe he said that. But not everyone lies maliciously. A lot of people will just lie by omission, or they'll paper over something that is perhaps they're uncomfortable about, or that they don't necessarily want to share openly about the nature of their situation. And when you work with symbolism, you have to be sort of sensitive to that, because there may be some other factor that's playing into what you're looking at that is very helpful when you're delivering a judgment or a prediction around something, that if you didn't know it, then you might look at it completely differently. So I was sensitive to the fact that this person's probably overstretched themselves if we think of Jupiter as an expansive energy, but money is probably really not going very well. We also see, if we turn this on its head, we've got the potential business partner here at the 7th house, ruled by the planet Mars. And what we see up here is Mars in Leo in the 11th house. So my approach to this wasn't so much to tell her if she should or shouldn't do it, but to give her, very much in the same spirit as Lily, give her as much information as I could so that she could then walk away and make a decision herself. So the Venus-Mars element I thought was an interesting one, like just because we're talking about the nature of a business partnership. So we get these 2 planets that symbolize romantic union, but here we find them in a business context. And when we've got Mars in the sign of Leo, this doesn't exactly scream someone who's probably going to want to work alongside you, right? Like, I mean, this is probably just at a very high level, somebody who probably prefers to do things their own way. We see Mars up there in the 11th house of freedom, that this person doesn't like to be boxed in. So what kind of partner are you looking for was something that I put on the table for her. We also see, if we take the 8th house as this person's finances, we see that the ruler of that house, Mercury, is right there smack bang in their 1st house. So this person's pretty interested in money. They probably try and hold on to as much as they can. But what we'd be looking for in a situation like this is whether or not there's even the option of these 2 people partnering. Is this even something that you can even feasibly do? So what we find here is Venus as the quicker moving planet at 15 degrees and 53 minutes is minutes away from perfecting a trine to Mars. So I said to her, look, this is something you can definitely do. If this is what you want, you can definitely do it. It does look like she's more interested in the union. In Horary, faster moving planets represent the people who are doing the chasing, the ones who are more eager. But she's already on the back foot here. So for all the reasons that we've already said, she's strapped for cash. She's probably overstretched herself. No doubt she's eager to try and make this situation come together. And in the end, the thing that I sort of led with was I got off the phone with her and I said, yeah, I think that you can do it if this is what you want. I had some reservations about the prospect. If we take the 10th house as potential profit from the merger, we see the moon down there in the 6th house. So I spent a lot of time in this particular chart underscoring that simply getting into business together was not going to fix everything. She was probably going to have to continue to keep toiling by virtue of the fact that we see the moon in the 6th house of slave work, really, sort of menial work. So she's probably expecting to remain the big boss. And upon entering this union, it looks like she would be playing a rather menial role. So I got off the phone. I said, look, just as long as you're down for that, if that's what you want to do, then go right ahead, right? And I got off the phone from her and I kept looking at this chart and I was like, oh my God, the moon's going to come into an application with Saturn. And I'm sort of famous for not being overly professional. I like to keep it pretty real. And I think I sent her an email and I said, look, there's a boner killer that's on the way. And I said, you could make this union work. It could happen, but I think it's possibly going to fall apart because you've got the moon coming to an application with Saturn. And I didn't hear from her for months. And, you go away and you're like, God, maybe I shouldn't have said boner killer. You go back through things. Anyway, she got back in contact with me and she said, oh my God, she's, you were completely right. And she brought it up. She said, I couldn't stop thinking about what you said. There's a boner killer. And she's like, there was. So it did end up falling apart. There was the option that was there, but it just didn't work out to be fruitful. Yeah.
The other thing that's interesting in charts is certain things will show up that tell me, okay, this is going to be a problem, right? So the third moon in Pisces, I'm thinking she might be slightly confused when not looking at the situation realistically.
Yeah.
The other thing that would be really worrisome is the two significators they're missing a house because the sign that they ruled is what's the word? Intercepted. So they don't have their full assets. I'd be like, you might want to look at that.
Yeah, absolutely. So
it is very close to the North Node.
Right.
Yeah, always precarious. It's like I think of the nodes often like snakes and ladders a bit. The idea that it could be good 1 minute, but then watch out, But all good points, and in this situation, as eager as she was, it just kind of all fell apart very quickly. With her being in detriment, I don't think she really had much to offer, to be honest. I mean, she was really in a situation where she needed this person more than the other way around. And this person being in the 11th house in Leo, this is somebody that probably has their eyes set on the future, like big and shiny things, right? And we could of course say a lot more about that, but just at a very high level here. I just want to show one more chart. Let me just there's a general sense. So the question, just for anyone who didn't hear, are the nodes bad in Horary? I feel like the more that I use astrology, I feel like the nodes are always bad. For lack of a better phrase, show me a chart where something's on a node and things have gone well, yeah.
Close to the node that despite telling something may go ahead and then it will.
Yeah. One of our my second wife's in the room, Rita, and Rita makes a good point in saying that the South Node is obviously very intimately connected with the North Node, and even though you may be seeing some sort of enlargement with the North Node, it is still inherently tied to the South. It's like this area of volatility, and we obviously know that this is Yeah, and like when we think about what happens when the luminaries line up with this axis, that's when we see an eclipse. Yeah. So I mean these are things that have signification with the lights losing energy. So yeah. So whenever something touches them, even though it might be great in the moment, it's not necessarily always going to be like that. There's usually circumstances that are quite volatile. Even back in like I no secret to this, I studied for a really long time with Stephen Forrest, traveled the world following him around like a bad smell for years, and learned all about the spiritual approach to astrology, and it's deeply useful. I think that approach to nodal interpretation is so replicable. Like you can take this approach and almost just lock it in the bank that what you talk about through this application of Steve's is something that just happens over and over and over again. But does that necessarily have to mean that it's because of the nature of a past life? Of course, we all get to make up our own mind about that. Or is it simply that the South Node just represents an area that you have to be really careful of? And when you use this technique of unpacking what it means in a chart, it's like, here's something that could blow up in your face spectacularly. 27 years old, my nodal, was it the opposition? Yeah, I think it's the opposition. It's been a while since I've thought about that. It is, because 19's the full cycle. Yeah. And it was like this awful period in life. Like I have a South Node in Libra. So if we followed the what do you call it, the prior life narrative, I was somebody's beautiful wife, that just told to sit in the room and shut up, smile and look good, that sort of thing. So I come into the world and I talk like a sailor, and but I have a sensitivity in the realm of relationship, and it was really volatile until I got a handle on it. And I remember these nodes being activated and just talk about like drama. So yeah, I think that you can use them very well, but I'm getting a bit beyond the point. I think that the nodes are always kind of volatile all the time. I'm always careful of where they happen to be for sure.
It's quite a contrast to modern nature astrology, which is North Node is where you're going, it's your future, it's your destiny. No move towards that.
Totally. I spent a long time with other people that I learned with through that modern EA approach to astrology. And for a number of years there, it was like doing a psychology degree. It's like, oh, so your South Node. This is so my South Node. I just keep doing it and do everything was about the South Node. And it got to a point where it's, at what point have you learnt that lesson? And I'm not going to sort of claim to have the final word on all of that, but it certainly was a stepping stone for me for sure. And I think that there's so much there. There's so much rich material in that approach to astrology. But like I said before, if we're at this pivot, what works? Like, how much can we reliably put in the bank? How much do we know for certain actually works? And where do we have to step outside of astrology to accept what's there? Which is where we get on sort of shaky ground. But how are we for time? We may not have time for the next one. I'll just quickly show you.
Quickly, and then we'll move into maybe a bit of Q&A.
Yeah, just very quickly. This is a chart fairly recently. You can see 23rd of Jan 2026. This was a chart from somebody who reached out and is married, is going through a bit of a rocky time, and wanted to know whether or not it was worthwhile trying again. So they're not separated yet, but things are pretty hairy. And this was a sort of challenging consultation or reading. I don't actually like the word consultation. It was a challenging reading because we see Saturn's over here on the ascendant, and Saturn has a lot to do with melancholy, as we know, a lot to do with fear. And we see 28 degrees. So, I mean, even just at a very high level, I felt like this was a relationship there's already an answer there. And I felt like she was trying to find a way out of what she already knew. We see the ruler here, Jupiter over there, quite strong in the fourth house. Very aptly described her and the role in the relationship. She was the one who took care of everything, basically. Like, she was very focused on the domestic needs of the household. They've got children, that she's the one who kind of held everything together. Conversely, the partner over here, ruled by the planet Mercury, in a fairly tight conjunction with Pluto, but up there in the 11th house of freedom, among other things. If this was a legal chart from hundreds of years ago, someone's, am I going to go to the stocks or the Tower of London? You see their significator in the 11th. That's fantastic. No, you're walking free. But in this context, it was just the first thing that popped into my head. Absolutely not. This person sees themselves as out of there, that they've got every agenda. So where you see a planet placed in the chart, it's not necessarily just giving you a prediction about what's going to happen, but also telling you about what's going on in terms of their motivation. So here we see just contrasting these two planets, we've got Jupiter in the 4th house, quite focused on the domestic reality, and we've got the soon-to-be ex-partner over here thinking about being footloose and fancy free, and she's here asking whether or not there's this opportunity for them to come back together. It's also worth noting that there is no aspect that's formed here between Mercury and Jupiter, which is just another thing basically showing us that there's very little that actually pulls these two people together anymore, that there's a lack of connection. Yeah.
It's funny because in this chart, the moon literally does not rule a house.
Mm.
And she's trying, again, it has nothing.
Yeah.
And this is the 12th, which is.
Yeah, I mean, I think most astrologers, well, most I trained with the School of Traditional Astrology, and in a sceptred house, we'd say it's a co-ruler. So we'd sort of say it co-rules the 4th, but you do make a good point. I mean, it's intercepted. Alfie Lavoie, for anyone who doesn't know Alfie, I devoured Alfie's Horary books when I was a young astrologer. And I was sort of reading Horary under the covers at night because I didn't want anyone to know I was dabbling in the dark arts. And I was reading Alfie's books, and he actually says a lot about intercepted houses. He sees them as having a secret of some kind, I don't know that I would reliably say that, but I mean, it's worth like noting in this context. This is the situation that's still unfolding, but I actually heard from this person recently, and it's not looking good. That it's pretty dark.
It's the sign on the cusp is ruling it. That's still the partner. It's still the same problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we see like that Saturn Neptune energy. Yeah, a lot of confusion, probably a lot of fear about what's going to happen. At this point, my advice mostly was don't feel like you have to make a decision right now. Like just let some things unfold. And ultimately, I felt like the decision would be made for her through circumstance because it looks like it's already too far gone. But there was a lot of other things in here too that I found out were accurate predictions. Like just in terms of the 10th house being also at 28 degrees and Jupiter moving retrograde. This person had applied for a job, and I said, well, you're probably not going to hear about it until Jupiter goes direct. And at this time, that seemed ludicrous because you assume that a job's going to move quite quickly. No, it was right. It wasn't until Jupiter turned around and went direct that she got insight about the job. Still hasn't started. But it's still moving ahead. Like this was back in January. Like where are we now? Like what are we? March? Like this is months. And at the time that sort of sounded ridiculous, but here we are still like, I mean, everything's still progressing. It just hasn't started yet. Which is interesting. But it's funny because like when you look at something like that, the context of this question was strictly speaking about the relationship, but then you see the fingerprints of these other areas of life that are inherently connected with the context of the question that sort of pop up here as well, which is challenging with Horary because you don't know all the time if you're seeing like a broad overview of the life or not, but we get a bit into the weeds with that. So let me just clear this up. So I hope
12th house.
Yeah.
Ruling the intercepted 4th house. Would she be feeling a bit like a prisoner at home?
I think that was the case at the time, yeah. That it basically was all her responsibility. Yeah. The difference between, like, if we were to take into account the notion of essential dignity, and the strength of the planets, part of what was creating the problem in this dynamic was that early in the piece, the querent was given a lot of responsibility by their partner. You take care of the bills, you take care of this, you take care of that. And then as the years ticked on, when there's gentle reminders, we've got to pay this bill, we need to do this. It's like, get off my back. you know, you're such a dictator. And we see Jupiter here
Yeah.
exalted. So this person sort of has been given all this responsibility, but is viewed by the partner as this dictator of sorts. So it's sort of like a situation that began and then over time just got turned, yeah, in a different way. So I think that what you're saying is very right because it was. Mm.
So an out of that confusion of the ascendant 12th house kind of thing.
Yeah.
See, there's like
Yeah.
out is going to come sometime.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I think that there was a feeling of sort of I'm trapped in this role of authoritative partner. You know, nothing happens without me, basically. But again, fascinating example. For anyone who is interested in learning more about Horary, it's fascinating. I love it. It's my favorite thing. And both Rosalind and myself are actually presenting a 20-week program as part of the School of Traditional Astrology that starts in June. And that's something where it's being led by Eve Dembowski. I should not leave Eve out. She'd cane me for that. But Eve's basically delivering the course in let me say that again. Eve's delivering the course for the majority, and Ros and I are just helping out every now and then. And Eve's been teaching this course for what, 15 years or something? Over a decade. So Eve has been an established figure at the School of Traditional Astrology for a long time. I just want to mention it for anyone that is interested about it, because part of what we've been trying to do with the Traditional Astrology Australia site is bring a bit more awareness to Australia. You know, we're always having to sign up for things in the US and, you know, sign up for things at different time zones. I spent well over a year or more getting up for things at like 5 a.m, which is a Herculean effort for me. So this course is actually being run in the Australian time zone, just for people who are interested. So go and check it out. That's the link, traditionalastrologyaustralia.com/STA Horary. It may be up on the STA site itself, but you'll find the majority of the information there anyway. But
it's interesting when you mentioned going back to the Delphic Oracle, that they all lined up in the hot sun, but they have like one question.
Yeah.
It's so completely different today. They don't come with one question. They won't tell you the question. As I said, they lie all the time.
Yeah. It's an interesting world. Yeah. So I hope everyone enjoyed that.
We'll just look maybe 10 minutes or so. Particularly to let people online as well.
If there are any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat box or
Stop sharing so they can see.
Yeah.
Full screen.
Amazing. Is that good? Yeah.
Yeah. So Josh, 2 observations I had.
Yeah.
One, I'm a big fan of Jeffrey Cornelius. I think you are as well.
Yeah.
So his book, The Moment of Astrology, asks us to think about time. And even I think Ptolemy was a little bit restless on the seed moment, acknowledging that probably conception was the true seed moment, not the birth. Or that at least there's a debate around that. I know there is some astrology concerning conception, which is practiced off to the sides, I guess. And certainly in natal astrology, the notion that it begins with the first breath brings up, well, when was the first breath? And do we rely on the hospital records? And how accurate was the mother's memory? And so on. And, you know, also getting back to your question of, well, everyone seems to come late for your appointments. Is it the gods that are holding them up so that they're lined up? It's a very elusive thing, time. That was one observation. And what was the other one I had to do with? I'll come back to it anyway. That was one on time. Sorry, the other one was on radicality. I beg your pardon, because to me, radicality is when the chart is talking to you. Whether it be natal astrology or horary or tarot or any other system. When it's coming to life with you. And I think, again, Jeffrey Cornelius puts a lot of emphasis on this. You can't take the astrologer or the tarot reader or the out of the equation. They're critical to the whole exercise. And so And we've all had, I think, experiences where you're trying to force the issue. I'm trying to find something in the natal chart or a horary chart or tarot cards to make this a worthwhile exercise. And
Yeah.
it just is not talking to you.
Yeah.
But when it talks to you, there's a deep inner feeling, which I guess we would call our intuition, which is fired up and it's on. Then it's coming to life, then it's
Yeah.
radical.
Yeah.
So there are a couple of
Yeah,
options.
with the tarot, there's the occasional reading, as soon as you lay out the card, sometimes you immediately know they didn't form a question in their mind. They want you to fix it or say it or whatever. And you think this is not a layout that's working.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen very often, but it happens every so often, and you just want to shake them and say, "Didn't I tell you to ask a question?"
I said that when it comes to life, I guess it's.
Yeah.
And I know
And
when
the other
Billy
thing
was
that-
very big on that, honouring
Yeah.
that higher.
And the other thing with conception, now I have twin sons who are 53 years old. And they have Aries ascendant with 19 and 20 degrees Aries, so dwarfs of Scorpio and Sagittarius. And they are completely different as they got older. But you can imagine, how would I work out a conception difference, for example? You know, now I wasn't even an astrologer at the time they were born, but I can tell you I was looking at the clock.
Well, you were there. Yeah.
Yeah, I was there, I was looking at the clock. Because even though I wasn't astrology, because I'm born in India, you're brought up with astrology in your head.
Right,
You're
right.
surrounded by it. So I was definitely looking at the clock in front of me. And so I knew exactly what time they're born.
Yeah.
And
There's
the thing is, if I went to conception, I would really have very little information on them.
There's,
A chart where I could break down the dwarfs and the ruling planets of the dwarfs.
Yeah. There's a book that, for anyone who doesn't know, Philip Graves. Has everyone heard of Philip? Philip runs this like I have an exalted Mercury. So I'm like a book freak, you know. I see a book and I'm like, you must come home with me. And the fact that Philip has like this huge astrological library, it's just like it titillates me. So I like to try and support his store as much as I can, and I just often, like, whenever I have like too much disposable income, it's gone in half a second because I'm buying more books. I have to hide from my partner. And there's a book I bought from Philip by, I think it's E.H. Bailey, and it's all about the conception. And have I cracked it? No. But you're reminding me, maybe this is like a sign from the universe to read that. It's a conception moment.
You can do it in solar fire, and I think it's a
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious to read it, but
I think the point was that time is very elusive, you know.
oh, totally.
We always
Yeah.
want to hang on to it in astrology. Time's really important.
Yeah.
It kind of is, and then it isn't.
With conception with triplets, for example,
Yeah.
what kind of a chart are you going to come up with triplets for conception?
Similar that we would have in the birth chart. They're all born one after the other.
Something that's sort of
Yeah,
like
said that 1 degree made a difference. 1 degree made a difference in the case of my son's charts.
my one of our colleagues, Morgan LaCall, who also does some work with the STA, he has done this really fantastic presentation on physically ascribing attributes based on charts. And one of the women had twin daughters, and Morgan was just beautifully demonstrating how you could see in the chart the difference between people who were born even quite close together. And he used the dodecatemoria system. For anyone who doesn't, is everyone familiar with that? It's like where you split up each sign of the zodiac has a division by 12. Yeah. So even like the difference of like a few minutes, and you'll get like a different dodecatemoria symbol that would be rising, and it directly showed the difference in physical attributes between these twins because they're quite different. From memory, I think one was really buxom and one wasn't. But just to throw in with this idea of twins, that seems to be a useful way of using it. Do you need it with everyone? Probably not, but
You want to see if there's anyone online who has a question?
yeah, I did put that out. If anyone has any questions, feel free. Either unmute yourself or just pop it in the chat. But
Yeah, when you're talking about twins, I knew someone that was a twin, and they were totally different. There's only 5 minutes apart, but they were different rising signs.
yeah.
And even if you're talking a 2 or 3 minute difference in time, that'd be a 30-minute difference in astrological time because it's 15 times slower.
small amounts of difference, potentially the numbers.
Yeah, well, I'm looking at the time.
That's degree,
Yeah.
you know, or the minutes be.
Yeah.
Fine.
So my twins are 4 minutes apart. Aries 19 rising, Aries 20 rising. One ruled by Mars, one ruled by Jupiter. And the Jupiter one is very Jupiterian, but also the Scorpio one is quite secretive. Still,
And that, but that's only a minute.
that's 4 minutes apart, one degree difference,
It is changing.
4 minutes.
Well, thank you, everyone. Is there any other questions? Oh,
I've got a question.
oh yeah, hang on. Yep. Yeah.
When we do all those readings, what do people think of? Because I believe, I was saying words, I believe that you have to look at everything and what you're feeling at the moment. And just looking at that woman who said, well, she split up,
Mm.
you just have to look around all the time. And the whole date that she was there, hello, never there,
Yeah.
was 16/7 the Tower.
Yeah.
And you think, well, why has she come in on this day? And you think, oh, Tower, good, gone.
Yeah.
You have to look at a few other things, and I'll be flipping a card
Yeah. Yeah.
because I like to flip the cards. But it's hard. What I'm trying to say, it's hard to just go to one area and be succinct,
Yeah.
because then you second guess yourself. And you think, oh, send them out, say they're rotten, and it's a lot of responsibility on you, and that's what you know, and that's what you delayed, and that's what you're losing sleep about the boner and all of this.
Yeah. I definitely lose sleep over that. But yeah, there was a question here online too.
Who was that?
Yeah. Hi.
Hey, Kate.
Yeah. Hi. I just wanted to make the comment that two things. One is that the Vedic system uses the 60th divisional chart for twins. Just as another, which is sort of like very finely divided and has meanings and God knows what. But my question actually has nothing to do with that. I was just, with the last chart that you put up, the woman who was unhappy in her marriage.
Yeah.
I know you have Jupiter in Cancer, but did you say something earlier about that you reverse the signs sometimes for Southern Hemisphere?
No. Was there a comment? I think there was a comment. Well, the short answer is no.
Right.
Yeah.
I just wondered because I caught something earlier which I didn't fully.
I can't remember the gist of it. Can you?
No, not. Was it moving away from Jupiter or something? I don't know.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
As a joke, yeah. Yeah. Just on that though, I mean, I have played around with that as an idea, in terms of the way that we experience things. It's kind of one of those situations though, you pull one thing and the rest just begins to fall apart. You can't change one thing without the whole system having to change, right? Which just becomes really problematic. But then once again, going back to the whole physical association with the symbolism, that seems to work irrespective of if you were born in the Northern Hemisphere or the South. So I don't see the necessity for it personally.
Yeah, I just thought of asking you that because she had that Jupiter in the fourth in its exaltation.
Yeah.
And but yet she said she felt she was living in a prison, and I thought maybe it's debilitated in Capricorn. I was just toying around with the idea,
Yeah.
Yeah, the chart examples you brought up were very interesting. I would have liked more juicy details.
Yeah. That's why I keep doing this. I'm such a gossip fiend. That's not even a joke.
Thank you very much. That was an interesting talk.
Well, let's put our hands together, I think. Very good. With that, well done. Thank you. Just perhaps two things before we just break up. One, if you'd like to become a member of SARs, you can apply online. We have two membership levels, a full membership and also a concessional level, which is at a discount to the normal month-to-month meeting prices. And it supports the community that we feel in a lot of ways we're trying to reinvigorate this year by coming back and meeting in a pub and having a casual and conversation and so on. So just bear that in mind.
It's outside there.
Yeah. And second thing is everyone's welcome to stay back and have a drink or a glass of water or whatever, and just carry on. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Can I just ask you a simple question? I actually took up the membership, but I can't access past talks or anything because the email that you send out with the link of the memberships area doesn't actually have a button. And I've emailed admin, but no one's responded. Who looks after that, or who should I email it to?
Yeah, no, we'll get back onto that through admin, but it's now on YouTube.
Speak to that point now.
Yeah,
Okay. We
okay.
got a lot of people who are asking this question. So just on the so membership in terms of accessing past talks, they're all now on YouTube. So what happens effectively, there's no button on the website. So any of the talks that we have as a member, this talk, Josh's talk, will go live, and it'll be live and accessible to everybody for a week. And then it will be on YouTube. So that's how we access the past
private
talks.
site on YouTube. Yeah.
That's right.
I
Yeah, there's a
had
channel.
the same problem. And you just sent me a link to YouTube and
That's right. Yeah, so it's all on YouTube in a private channel. Okay.
Okay. Oh, okay, cool. Do you send us the channel link, or how does that work?
Will you send her the channel link?
Yeah. Yeah, I will send you the channel link. It's a SARs channel, so yeah, you will get access to that.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, over and out.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
Have a
you.
good night.